Sometimes I think teachers wait for the system to give them space or permission to take risks or to follow their students. And we have no time to waste, right? Like you've got the child before you, the student before you, have them for a year, perhaps a semester, and you're the most powerful influence in their learning experience.
100 connected minds for human flourishing.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet that we share together. Welcome to the 100 Connected podcast, and we are so glad that you're here with us today. My name is Annette De Graaf from The Flow Approach, calling in from Norway, and I am joined by Hanneke and Mackie from Kidz, South Africa. Hello, Hanneke.
Hi. Hi.
And there's Alex Shapero from the HundrED headquarters in Helsinki, Finland.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be here.
Yay. And in this episode, we are going to talk with an amazing guest. He is a crazy inspiring educator, not crazy inspiring educator, author, and speaker. And his name is Trevor MacKenzie. Hello, Trevor.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Very kind of you, Annette, and really pleased to be here. Excited for our conversation today. Thank you.
Trevor is an educator, author, and speaker, and he has inspired educators all over the world to bring more curiosity, agency, and joy into learning. He is known for his books, Dive into Inquiry and the Inquiry Mindset series, including the questions, assessments, and elementary editions, and for his hands-on work with schools across the world, from Australia to Asia, North America to South Africa, and Europe. Trevor supports educators throughout workshops, keynotes, and his collaborative learning lab, where educators co-plan, co-educate, and reflect together to deepen inquiry practice. Trevor travels the world helping educators and learners give curiosity legs to let it come alive and move out of their heads and hearts into the classroom. Or actually, better said, he helps to give curiosity a voice. He creates movement and progression, a ripple effect that helps learners feel seen and heard, and inspires them to think, question, and learn with purpose. Trevor educates not only educators and learners, he also embodies being a lifelong learner himself. And I am a huge fan of everything you do, Trevor. I think for the past 4 years, when I think it started when I gave you advice where to buy the best chocolate chip cookies in Granada, in Spain. I think that's where it
Correct?
started.
Yeah.
And I'm also really grateful for all your support about all the mindset and the flow work that I've been doing recently. So thank you so much for that. And to start this conversation, to hear it in your own words, I would like you to take us back in time and go back to the start where that love, that passion for inquiry started for you.
Wow. Well, what an introduction. I'm blushing there. You got me. So thank you. Very kind of you. And, if I were to go back to my origin story to a certain degree with regards to why inquiry is a stance for me, definitely in my formative years as a teacher, gosh, I think to my very first contract as a teacher, I was really working with students who the traditional schooling experience just was not working for them for one reason or another. And it really forced me to reimagine and rethink and to listen. And I'm just so fortunate that I was surrounded by colleagues. There was a very strong mentorship model at this school and very much an action research kind of infused experience. We tried on new things. We gave it a crack. We came together and we spoke about it. We talked about it. We all did little deep dives into researching and exploring different structures and routines and techniques. And, my teacher librarian at the time, he would just like spoon feed me these little morsels, whether it was an email or a newsletter or an article in my, staff mailbox. Slowly those first 4 or 5 years, I was somewhat forced by my students to reimagine what teaching might look like. but I was surrounded by reflective practitioners. Without even knowing it, I was learning how to unlearn and learning how to learn together. So I think my students, I think this is not anything innovative. It's not anything, transformative in terms of new age teaching. I think listening to children, listening to students, it's at the heart of teaching. And I'm grateful that I had the students I had in the first 5 years that really forced me to rethink what my role is in the classroom. So, that's definitely that the formative years created the need or the desire, the motivation to do something different. And gosh, there are so many other little things that have led to where I am today, standing on the shoulders of giants, both those mentors in my school, but also authors and researchers that I just found so nourishing during those needy years of my career that now looking back at it, I didn't know the language of inquiry then, but it was certainly bubbling up through my interactions with students and peers, colleagues, and then the readings in it. So there's so much more to crack open there. Gosh, 20, 25 years ago and where I am now compared to where I am then. And as you said, lifelong learner, who knows where we'll be in 15, 20 years as well. We don't stop learning, do we? So yeah, and that's a little bit of the origin story, if you will.
Do you remember like a moment of like, okay, now the light bulb is on, it's switched on. So it gradually like grew. But do you remember one of those moments that you still remember?
Gosh, there are many. There are so many interactions with students where you see their eyes light up, you see their hearts fill up. I think too, as an English teacher, I was trying to teach symbolism, for example, and I thought I had this amazing short story that was going to help students see symbolism and grasp symbolism in this story. And the symbolism in the story, it's vibrant, but it wasn't culturally aligned with the students that I was teaching. It wasn't something that was relatable to them. It wasn't something that they could connect to contextually in their community and their previous experiences in their family. And a colleague, a mentor, again, suggested, well, why don't you shift away from that story and adopt a symbolism or a symbol that is culturally, aligned. And well, I had to be a learner. I had to say, well, can you help me? What might be a symbol that my students might grasp and grab onto and run with? And the suggestion was so helpful. And it was an immediate shift for the students. Like their oracy just came alive. Their writing was stronger. And more importantly than talking and writing, it was they saw themselves in the learning. And I saw that they saw themselves in the learning. It was like, the light bulb went on for me, it went on for them, and it filled my heart as well. It was much more meaningful, much more joyful. And it really put into perspective, what am I bringing to the table as a teacher for these students to learn from? And how can I listen to them more? How can I plan towards them more? And how can I let go of some misconceptions of what I thought I need to bring and start with them? I learned so many of those lessons early in my career. Just the curriculum is mobile, it's agile. We can sculpt it with the children, with the students. It's not something that I have to dump onto them, right? Metaphorically speaking. And I'm sure my light bulb moments, not only would they resonate with colleagues, but I'm certain colleagues have very similar experiences and stories. Just even on this call, I saw you nodding your heads and in agreement and accessing prior knowledge and thinking of your own teaching experiences. What we're talking about is not too uncommon in what we notice in children and students. It's the next step after that. Once that noticing, how do we bring that more routinely, more commonly, more consistently? How do we have that be the baseline experience for everyone and not just the few children that get the benefit of those unique and special experiences? So growing it into something that is the baseline, is the normative, it's the culture, I think is something that, of course, my authorship, my workshops, my work with schools really aims to support teachers in having in that joyful space of teaching, if you will.
So I'm quite curious about the definition of inquiry learning. If we can maybe start with a bit of a definition for someone who maybe have never heard of inquiry or inquiry-based learning, help us understand that as if we've just come new to it, Trevor, please.
Yeah. I'm so pleased that you've asked that question because when you look at the body of research around inquiry, and the body of research, it's decades old and there's new papers, articles, research being done, of course, day to day, month to month. When you look at the body of research, The research tells a tale of two stories. One side of the research talks about inquiry as being a hot mess. It's little more than asking our students quote unquote ungoogleable questions and putting them into circumstances to solve those questions. And I'm talking like young children, students, teenagers, and of course, students in that kind of frame of inquiry, they're going to feel anxious, overwhelmed, uncertain. And so are the teachers, right? Like that's a hot mess for us, just as it is for them. So the other side of the research talks about inquiry being scaffolded, intentionally planned, competency rich, where we're helping our students flex certain skills and dispositions, and that scaffolding and structures and routines are necessary if we're giving agency over learning. So I call that a powerful side of inquiry, the side of inquiry we want to lean into. When you look specifically at some of this research, they're actually talking about two very different types of inquiry. They're talking about two very different definitions of inquiry. So when we come together as a school, a community of learners, it's very important that we, grapple with this and we come to our definition of inquiry. So we're on the same page so we can collaborate, we can talk, we can plan, through the same language, and our students are going to benefit. They're going to go from class to class and year to year with a kind of an idea of what the landscape of learning is going to look like and sound like and feel like. So the definition of inquiry, and there isn't one definition we're going to lean into. It's really important for us to come to terms with and come to. If I were to boil it down to one thing, I love to say that inquiry is curiosity. If we're getting our kids curious about the curriculum, we're already doing a lot of those things. We're already listening to the children. We're already planning from their curiosities and from their questions. And it's something we value. We want curious kids. The research around curiosity, it says that curiosity is like a campfire, as in, if you spark curiosity in a child, other people want to be around that curiosity. Like it's attracting, the inquisitiveness in the room grows when one person is curious. So, that's a piece of it. Essentially, the inquiry classroom is exploring our questions, our wonderings, our curiosities, and having those lead us through the curriculum, leading to next steps in learning. So teachers that are listening, if they're getting their kids curious, we're already doing a lot of the good work, Hanneke.
Thanks for that, Trevor. I love it when we make things really plain for our conversation and also for our listeners, for the people who watch us. Am I correct in understanding it's almost like an approach and a language to information and learning itself, as opposed to a curriculum? And the reason I ask is because in many of the schools we work with here in South Africa, as you know, because you also are present here and do some work in South Africa, there's a lot of different curriculum sets and frameworks that schools will adopt. There's the national one, but then there's the IB curriculum, the Cambridge, etc., etc. And I have found that many teachers will say, we're doing the inquiry curriculum. I've always been a little bit baffled by that, and I've wanted to poke at it and go, isn't that almost like a language with which you learn potentially about the same curriculum or set of information? Is it almost like you've got a different set of, or an additional set of paintbrushes to paint with which you can come at any kind of teaching? So in other words, do you think it's possible for any teacher anywhere in any curriculum framework to borrow from or lean into inquiry-based approaches, to borrow from it and just bring it in, or is it very set?
Yeah, no, absolutely. My short answer is yes, but the longer answer we'll unpack together. Curriculum globally, it's what we need to teach. The inquiry is how we teach it. It's the stance of which we bring to our classroom and the lens of which we look at our curriculum through. I've never seen a curriculum that's a roadmap. I've never seen a curriculum that says you teach this, 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 this. I've seen modules, I've seen, resources, but curricula really is, these are what we need to teach, and these are the skills students need to flex. How we go about teaching that content standards, or those content standards and those competency standards, that's the art and the gift and the agency the teacher has over how we show up in the stance of which we take. So teaching from an inquiry stance, really a part of that means we have certain routines and structures that are more agentic by design. They're more inclusive by design. There's certainly not a top-down model in the inquiry classroom where I'm just talking at the students for a whole day. There's a co-design, there's a inclusivity in the structures and routines that we are utilizing. So curriculum, again, it's not the roadmap, it's not how we teach it, it's what we need students to perhaps know, do, and understand. Now, that being said, there's certain curricula that's more aligned with inquiry values. And there's certain curricula around the world that's jammed packed with content standards. You know, when I started teaching many years ago, our curriculum here in British Columbia, Canada, had roughly 150 prescribed learning outcomes that students had to demonstrate as a student across a span of time. And because there are so many checklisty things, that really created a lack of bandwidth and a feeling of tension for the teacher, meaning I've got to get through all this material. There's no space for agency or curiosity. So those really jam-packed curriculums can be problematic. But I have to be honest, a really simple mindset shift and how we design learning with some of those routines and structures allows even the most rigid curriculum to be explored through an inquiry stance. So I love kind of pushing through those doors in spaces I get to visit, metaphorically, and looking at those rigid curricula and then helping teachers understand those routines and structures so they can see how it could be a both and more and not an either or. Hanneke, does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it gives me so much ammunition to go into the world here and where we work. So thank you so much for that. I think that, it also just speaks back to, I'm at a conference currently and we're talking a lot about the redefinition of education in the world at the moment. And with AI and just so much information at our fingertips, it's not going to be about the what and the information regurgitation at all anymore. So content-rich learning, it's all about the love of learning being passed on, the love of curiosity, and how a teacher or helps the child, leads the child to open their mind towards curiosity and learning and wanting to learn. And then I guess on the other side is about the skills development in the child as opposed to what they can sort of regurgitate.
Trevor, it's really great to hear this from both. I know you have the perspective of both a teacher and somebody who now does teacher training, and that kind of development is crucially important. And in my work with all of the innovative solutions that we have around the world in our network, the number one thing that comes up is that teachers need the support almost more than the students do. And in my own experience, I use something that I think is really in line with inquiry-based methods. In my classroom, I taught French and I used a lot of comprehensible input and question-based storytelling methods. And that shares this idea of following your curiosity, of building something together and of following this thread. And I know that for me, when I discovered this, I was a novice teacher, kind of like you in your moment. And I kind of didn't know enough to be afraid of doing it in some ways. But a lot of veteran teachers had their things that they know that work. And the idea of jumping into something that was very different, even if you could just kind of do little teardrops into the tea to help them get started. But I wonder, how has that been for you? And to give a little bit of context for some of our listeners who might not know, one of the big metaphors that you use for diving into inquiry, and the reason I suspect it's called diving, is your pool, right? Of the shallow end and moving into the deep end. How does that metaphor help you with teachers? And what have been some of the ways that have been most effective for you in communicating and helping build the confidence for them to go out and try something a little bit different that maybe
Yeah.
there's against the stream?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I think that the swimming pool graphic, that metaphor, that analogy, well, first and foremost, it helps clarify what we mean by inquiry. Going back to the initial question, can we define inquiry? Many spaces that I visit, Alex, teachers, when we say inquiry, they think of the deep end of the swimming pool, kicking our kids into the deep end. They're going to feel overwhelmed, anxious, and uncertain, just like the research tells us is the case. The swimming pool allows teachers to see that that's a part of inquiry, but that's not necessarily the objective. And that's not solely what we mean by inquiry. And then giving teachers permission to start in the shallow end, as you mentioned, the little drips, getting them into the pool of inquiry safely, quote unquote, and then giving them the right tools and structures and routines. A key piece of that inquiry pool is that there are inquiry structures and protocols and routines that inquiry teachers use in their teaching repertoire. And in my work with schools globally, my experience has been many teachers that are new to inquiry, of course, don't know these routines. They don't know these structures. They might know a few, and they do them perhaps as one-off experiences here or there. That was fun, that was engaging, but I got to get back to the teaching now. And so mapping out those structures and routines and showing how we might use them as a vehicle for our curriculum, really helpful for teachers to see the return on investment in doing something differently than what they would typically do. I think a key piece that is globally, it's all around us. It's in the conversations around curriculum, assessment, economies. It's the need for competency development, for skill development, for students to leave our schools with a bundle of transferable skills. And inquiry allows those skills to bubble up. It allows students to strengthen those skills. So when we talk about a return on investment, that's something I really call on teachers to consider is how might doing something different get you more than what you value currently, and also this other side of the coin, the competency development. That both and more is really important when teaching from an inquiry stance, but also we're seeing it in terms of curriculum development and assessment development, policy development, globally, is this shift, not just from a curriculum that is valuing the knowing, but now the doing and the understanding as well. So, Alex, I suppose that the pool allows teachers, to safely see themselves in inquiry and kind of self-select. We often talk about agency for students. Agency for teachers is something imperative. What we want for children, adults need to be experiencing. If we want curious kids, we need curious adults. The pool kind of calls on us to reimagine our role in the classroom and how we might safely, gradually release responsibility over learning in those small little doses, those micro moments, because those micro moments, they compound, they add on to each other, they build upon each other so beautifully with students. So it's not jumping into the deep end for our kids or for teachers. It's compounding those strong moves and routines across time, if you will, Alex.
Yeah. And I think that the metaphor also builds a permission structure for the teachers and reminds them that they do need those tools, right? If they're going to be lifeguards in this pool, that they need to have their life-saving rings, but also it's okay to have the water wings available too at the very beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The other thought that I had when you were talking about the number of content standards in the BC curriculum is this conversation about breadth versus depth. And I'm thinking about this in particular with science of reading and a lot of the understandings about what it takes to scaffold kids into being literate. And can you talk a little bit about which way inquiry tilts on that side and how that impacts learning overall?
Yeah, I think, inquiry allows us to teach from a conceptual lens. The conceptual lens is that depth piece. It's also the transferable piece. If we're looking at breadth, we're kind of sitting at the surface of learning. We might hit a lot of content standards. We might get a lot of the know, but we're certainly not getting to the rich do or understand that most curriculums are embracing globally. And again, if we value those transferable skills, those are going to bubble up in the doing and the understanding when we teach towards concepts. So the breadth versus depth, absolutely. We may narrow, if we had a magic wand to reimagine curriculum, we may narrow the breadth to allow for more depth. But even that, Alex, there are specific routines that we could do for both. We could teach the breadth while demonstrating the importance of the depth. And that's actually really important for students to see that there are certain content standards, certain closed-ended questions that allow us to get to the deep learning, that allow us to get to the open-ended questions, the conceptual learning. And that's almost like a bit of a research pathway, right? Like if we understand how the close leads to the open, how the breadth leads to the depth, that actually allows students to begin to take some agency over exploring those questions, finding relevant, helpful resources and information. There's a lot of transferable skills when we look at it through a bit of a both and more. But undeniably, I'm going to say we value more the depth than merely the breadth from an inquiry stance. I don't want watered down learning, and I don't want overwhelmed students. So there's a balance there, isn't there?
I'm excited to go back to the pool. So I hope that's okay, because I have another question about that. So this conversation really makes me miss all my colleagues at the International School of Amsterdam. Like learning about inquiry is just the love of my life. I love it so much and I really miss it. But on the other hand, it's really exciting because I'm working with this community here, municipality of 8 schools, and nobody knows anything about inquiry-based learning or about thinking routines, about question routines. So that's really exciting. And we are like at that shallow part of the pool, the very first step of that. And my question to you is like, when we use these question routine. So they love it. They're excited for that. How do we move on from that first part of the swimming pool to a little bit deeper? How does that transfer go? Like, what would you suggest?
So what's interesting, a key part of the swimming pool are that there are, again, specific structures and routines that allow us to get across the pool. One is what we call provocation. And I often ask teachers, can you give me a thumbs up, show a thumbs? Are you pretty well versed in provocation? Is this kind of, sometimes I use provocation, thumbs down. Provocation's a new word for me. So just kind of get a show of thumbs from all of us on the call, up, sideways, down. Okay, so I see a lot of thumbs up there. So provocation, and again, I would ask teachers to kind of self-assess. Provocation is designed to get our kids curious about the curriculum. We really value curiosity, but I really want to get kids curious about what I have to teach, right? I want to reimagine the curriculum through getting them curious towards the curriculum. It's great if a student is curious about Fortnite or YouTubing or unicorns, but I want them curious about the curriculum. That's my first responsibility. This is a key domino that we push over in our planning and then our implementation. If we plan provocation towards the curriculum and getting kids curious about the curriculum, all these other beautiful things are going to happen later on that allow us to get across the pool. We can't get across the pool unless students are curious about the curriculum, number one, because a byproduct of their curiosity are going to be questions that are inherently then curricular in nature. Because the provocation is designed to the curriculum, now students have some questions that are somewhat curricular. Now we can begin to map out those questions and somewhat co-design with students. We can somewhat begin to use those questions to get across the pool to a certain degree. So it all starts with that curiosity, as we said at the onset of the call. How do we do that more readily, more routinely? It's planning with provocation in mind, designing for curiosity through provocation towards our curriculum. Then we can start getting into, Annette, what you've raised, our question routines. Question routines, that's my fourth publication. Students can begin to sort and organize and justify their questions, as Alex was saying, for that close-ended kind of surface area learning, but also towards the deep learning, the conceptual. And once they begin to see how questions are mapped out and sorted, now we can begin to co-design next steps. Students can begin to pull a few questions that are closed and attach them to an open, and that could lead to some research, some interviewing, some planning of who or what or where might guide us in our learning. So, we're kind of talking about an inquiry framework in it. I'm kind of mapping out a little bit of a process that we're going to spiral through. If I were to rewind, it all starts with that provocation design. Unless we hit that provocation design, we're going to have a tough time getting through the rest of the swimming pool later on in a school year or later on in the months with students. Annette, does that ring true to you? Does that make sense?
I really, really want these educators to understand the power of inquiry, to understand the power of curiosity. But it's really interesting. We just actually, before we started recording here, Alex and I were talking about that. Often when you ask questions to, like when you're leading a workshop, and I'm still learning this too, like I want to have like this vibe of inquiry, of curiosity in the workshops that I lead, because I want it to come from them. I just don't want to talk the whole time. I want them to be involved and to be curious about what they're learning. So to be curious about curiosity, actually. And often when I ask a question, they're just sitting and staring at me and there's like no response. That was the wrong question. So then I'm really pushing myself to think about closer questions or like easier to answer questions, exactly what you just said, to get it started, to like warm up their brain, to warm up their active thinking skills, because many educators and children are just they have learned to listen. They have learned just to be quiet and to just go through the day and then go home. So to really start there, this helps so much to have these thinking routines, to have these question routines. And I love it so much how it's so hands-on. And now when you're explaining how to move on to a little bit of a deeper end of the pool, like gradually going there, that is just super helpful to make it more concrete.
Let's sit in that a little bit, Annette. You're kind of sharing with us that, you asked the group a question and it was kind of crickets. It was really quiet. And your reflection was that maybe it wasn't the right question. And I would beg you to consider that maybe it was the right question, but maybe a different structure would have gotten a different response. Maybe rather than, and I don't know if you did do this or did this, but many teachers will ask a question to a whole group of students. And, it's like fight or flight, kids freeze, and you'll see the brave extroverts put up their hand. And what we know to be true is if you ask them to turn and talk about a question, every child is going to engage. It's like all of a sudden there are all these perspectives that unless we did that little turn and talk structure, we're not going to see, we're not going to hear, and we're not going to engage. If we do that hands up model to a room, we're going to see a few people put up their hands. If we do a turn and talk structure, we see and hear from so many more voices. And that's just like one equitable talk structure, a turn and talk. That's not innovative. It is timeless. Question routines are different structures. I just workshopped for about 200 teachers question routines. And the fact that they're standing and talking and collaborating and critically thinking and justifying and communicating, like lots of talk, instantly, 200 people instantly. Those are all those transferable skills that are only going to bubble up if the structure, the routine is brought to the table. If they're just sitting and I'm asking a question to the room, I may be engaging a handful of people, but the structure engages more. It's a low floor, high ceiling structure, right? We have more students in the learning than out of the learning. And then what's magical is because the structure allows for more students to be engaged in the learning, I have more space to go differentiate to the students that need more of me. So the structures are also what we call structures for independence. They allow for more independent ownership over learning. So it actually frees me up to go work with the fewer kids who may be more dynamic learners, may need some more one-on-one time, may need to have a panda bear beside them, cuddling with them, bringing them into the learning a little bit more. What's fascinating is the structures reveal capability, which allow us to go be a more effective teacher to the students who need a greater dose of us. So again, it might not be that you asked the wrong question. You may have asked the just right question, but the structure would have gotten you something different from the learners in the room. Does that make sense, Annette?
You're so right. This is like so true. Exactly. Yeah. So I did switch at some point. It's like, oh yeah, we need to do think, pair, share, and even to write it down, to just like even start without sharing it first with the partner, also with learners. First, like take a minute just to think and then to write it down and then share. So I'm always trying to think about structure, but like this thing, when you're so used to swim in the deep end, then sometimes I forget how to go back to the shallow part.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
me as like an IB educator for 15 years, I was so used to have like this culture of thinking, this culture of making thinking visible. And when I would ask a question in a group, there would always be life. There would always be like movement and talking and thinking the whole time. Yeah, I
Yeah.
just have to go back actually from that deep and back to the shallow part.
Yeah. Yeah. A really nice move with students and with adult learners is to do the zoom in, zoom out move. Like we're going to zoom in and yes, we're talking about the details, right? I may be teaching adult learners a specific question routine, right? Where I'm walking them through the question routine. And then I'm going to pause and I'm going to say, okay, now we're going to zoom out of the question routine and I'm going to tell you my thinking. I'm going to tell you that the structure here. I'm going to tell you the process. I'm going to tell you why we're doing it this way with the students. So yes, we're learning about something. We zoom into something. What might we be learning about? The question routine, but then we're going to zoom out so everyone sees the thinking behind the mere routine. We would do the same thing with students, right? We will be learning about something. We're zoomed in, and then I'm going to call a timeout and I'm going to zoom out. I may draw their attention to something that's working really beautifully in the room, something we might shift and do differently. I may draw their attention to their thinking. What are you noticing about your noticing right now? So the zoom in, zoom out move, it's great for adults and it's great for children. It's great for students. We begin to see more awareness of that metacognitive side of their learning experience. It's not just what we're learning about. It's the how we're learning about it. And so when we zoom in, zoom out, you actually see this like greater awareness from your students. They begin to make connections that aren't merely kind of academic-y or content focused. They begin to make connections that are transferable to different contexts, right? Different subject areas and different life experiences, if you will. So the zoom in, zoom out move, I also sometimes call it investigation and consolidation. Those rich moments in a lesson where we call a time out to really clearly inform and talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it, how we might move forward. Okay.
I just as you guys went into this topic, I want to ask, what do you do about those, especially educators, because adults are sometimes harder to move? What do you do about people who don't want to move? And then Annette brought the story about how she's bringing this type of facilitation into this current context which she's in, and people are afraid to participate. And my work and the work that we do with Buzz Kids is around the arts and embodied and playful learning. And so I've never been an expert in the world of inquiry, but I was wondering how those two things are potentially friends, and where the body and somatic learning sits with and around inquiry. Because in my experience, when I walk into a room and I'm training a bunch of teachers on what we call Bring Learning Alive, to give them some key concepts of using movement and music and character play and improvisation as tools for teaching, when they come into the room, it's arms folded, hot water bottles, keys, bags. It's all weapons of protect me, don't ask me to participate. And as soon as we get those things away and I get you into the body, onto the floor, it's like something falls away and we are more mindful and we are more present. It's like a different part of the brain comes online for learning. We certainly see that with kids. As my big thing is really about learning through the body and through play, especially with little ones. But I'm wondering the relationship of the body. I mean, you already alluded to like turning to each other, just that small thing of turning to one another, and Annette alluded to the movement in the space. But talk to me from your experience and your deep knowledge about how the body and body-based learning for both the teacher and the child, how much of that, how do they sit together as friends or not?
Yeah. No, definitely friends, and definitely, yeah, closer than friends, they're relatives. Of all the things happening in education in the last kind of 5, 10 years, I think embodied learning for me is the most exciting bit of research, and what we're learning all the time that's new to us, and know better, do better about, starting in the body first if we want to, understand ourselves and be ready for learning. So incredibly important. So listeners, I encourage you to find more of that reading, more of those conversations. It's really important. Let's go back to provocation design. A key feature of provocation design is to build in some physical movement, right? We want kids, their hands in something, or we want them to be on their feet, partly because when it's physical, they're more fluidly collaborating and sharing their ideas and their perspectives. And traditionally, like, kids spend a lot of time in schools in their seats, and like, how liberating is it? How agentic is it for them to just be in their bodies, right? So in provocation design, physical movement is a piece, whether it's loose parts, whether it's a tactile provocation, whether it's something like a question routine that invites students to stand. And one thing we notice is when students are physically engaged in the learning, they self-regulate so beautifully. Like, I'll see students standing at a vertical surface, and literally they'll have the palm of their hand against the wall as though they're trying to push it over, right? And they're just kind of rocking into the wall. They're just leaning into the wall. And every teacher in the room knows what's happening there. That child is soothing, they're rocking, they're self-regulating. And you can't do that in a chair. Usually we give that child like a what do you call it? Like a squishy chair, a squishy cushion, so they can move in their seat, and we can keep them in their seat longer. Physical movement, baking an opportunity for them to be in their bodies. And then if we want to enrich that, it's draw their awareness to, what are you noticing about your learning? What are you noticing about your body? What are you noticing about yourself right now? And that's that zoom out move. Pause. How do you feel as a learner when you're physically engaged? How do you feel as a learner in this lesson? Typically after lunch, the blood is in the stomach, not in the brain. And now we're doing this physically engaging, curiosity rich activity. How does it feel for you? So that zoom in, zoom out is helpful for that notion as well. And then, Hanneke, I'm sure you see this with the adult learners that you work with. They need to live and breathe and experience what you're proposing to see the return on investment. You need to model the model for them. You just can't sit at the front of the room with a slide deck and talk about embodied learning and say, trust me, it's really joyful. Those educators need to see it. And you talked about somewhat of the melting of the shoulders and the opening of the safety as soon as they got onto the carpet. Modeling the model is so important in the workshopping that you all engage in, but it's also so important for us to do with the children. Like, if we want curious kids, model your curiosity. Like, put your finger to your chin and talk about your thinking. Like, show inquisitiveness, show an interest in the ideas in the room. That modeling, it's not superficial. It's like drawing the curtain back. None of that Wizard of Oz thing, right? Where we're behind the curtain orchestrating the whole world of learning for the kids. Draw the curtain back and share your thinking, share your curiosity, model that, especially at the younger years. But as we know this to be true, guess who needs it just as much? The adults. If they're going to let go of something that they've always done to get space for something different, modeling the model, Hanneke, is really important. So in short, I said, in short, yes, I agree. Embodied learning and inquiry are definitely interwoven, that they're closely connected. I don't think you see an inquiry stance where an inquiry classroom where kids are sitting in desks for hours, right? There's a lot of movement, and we need to anticipate that movement and that energy, because we don't want to tighten the reins of learning once we feel that. We talk about self-regulation for kids, self-regulation for us when we see and feel that energy, and so we can co-regulate and set the right temperature for inquiry, I think, is really important. Hanneke, how does that ring for you?
Absolutely beautiful and super inspiring. And I think with that, when we think about the skills of the future, what children are going to need to stand in the world, it's all going to be about those that remain curious and confident and good collaborators and speakers. So you are also then skill developing and building with that, which is something that speaks to the work that I do and that I really believe in. So I am very excited for everything I've learned here so far. It's been very insightful.
Thank you,
Hanneke,
my friend. Appreciate you.
sorry. Hanneke, I'm also thinking about the arts and like about music, pieces of art in a museum or in a school. And when you think about curiosity, arts are just like this natural source of curiosity, of like, I want to know, what is that? What does it look like? Why? Who made it? And I think like maybe to even have like a starter, like a shallow part of the pool, arts is wonderful to start to have
Yeah.
this taste of curiosity, natural curiosity. You don't even have to do anything, I think, as an educator. If you play music, if you start dancing, if you bring in an object like a provocation, like anything that they don't know from a different country, a piece of art or something. I'm just sorry, I'm just brainstorming about curiosity
No, I
in
Because
the
love it.
arts.
I love it.
you are activating for sure. I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist yet. I'll do that in another life. But you're certainly bringing different parts of the brain online for both the adult and for the child, and definitely a pathway through which the learning then takes place that is so much deeper and richer. And many of us in our lifetimes, we only came to this type of thinking when we were at university potentially, because we were educated in this potential way. And I think the idea that we can really give this to kids so much earlier is why this is so
Yeah.
powerful. Your work, Trevor, and the
Well,
trail
thank you.
that you blaze.
Yeah. I'd ask us to consider, and I love, Annette kind of grounding us and looking at the arts as a rich, nourishing grounds for us to kind of get in the pool of inquiry. But I see in every discipline, in every subject matter, in every subject area, it's rooted in curiosity. Like science, the scientific method is exploring a curiosity, right? English, like, why do we write? Why do we create? Right? Like, why is the author demonstrated, written, or what are they trying to portray? What tools are they using to convey that message? Math, the first kind of exit ticket for kids, that when they begin to get bored about math, their excuse is, why am I going to need to know this? They're dying to know why the math applies and relates to the world around them. And math, the strongest mathematicians are the ones that have a really strong, thread of curiosity through their work. Math certainly isn't just standing delivering, it's showing the contextual relevance of the processes and procedures of which we are trying to learn to look at the world through. Social studies, right? Like, the most important thing about history is not that these events happen in chronological order. It's the concepts that kind of swing back and forth, that the big ideas that rear their ugly heads. Dictatorship is nothing new, right? But the notion of asking questions about where and when and why and how, curiosity can fall beautifully in every discipline. It
Around us,
should
right?
be
It's
the
all
base
around us.
ground. It should be the baseline. It should. And so, yes, arts, but sometimes I hear teachers think, oh, inquiry is great for humanities, or
Mhm.
inquiry is great for the performing arts. Inquiry is a stance of which we teach from in every subject area. Some subject areas are traditionally taught in a certain way or a certain methodology. And so, in those faculties and those departments, it may take some really specific structures to help see a shift in how we might teach those subject areas. But certainly, inquiry is not, compartmentalized in our schools to different departments. It really is how we teach, how we show up, a stance of which we teach from, if you will.
Trevor, I've got a question that kind of dovetails off of that a little bit. But also, Hanneke, I want to say, as the resident neuroscientist, you're absolutely correct. It does activate more of the brain. And Hanneke and Trevor, as all of us have been talking, one of the concepts from community gathering research is the idea of generous authority. And it feels like a lot of what works for letting the kids have the room for the curiosity, giving teachers that space. It's really those structures. And when the structure is well done and then enacted upon, it disappears. It melts into the learning that's happening, into the ways that the interactions are happening. If you have a series of questions that you're going through, at first it might feel a little stilted, but then as you get used to using it and you see it for the tool that it is, it becomes a part of the body, like a tennis racket. The first 5 times you hit the ball, you feel it. And then after a while, it's just an extension of your arm. Trevor, when you're talking about all the ways that this inquiry can apply to different school subjects, I know that over the past years, you've been working in different contexts. And I'm wondering if you have an example of a way that inquiry has really stretched beyond what you thought it could be, a way that it's been done that you weren't expecting at all.
Yeah, well, I'm constantly surprised by not just what schools are able to do, but individual teachers. I think those are the most powerful stories. Sometimes I think teachers wait for the system to give them space or permission to take risks or to follow their students. And we have no time to waste, right? Like, you've got the child before you, the student before you, have them for a year, perhaps a semester, and you're the most powerful influence in their learning experience. So I think some of the most powerful things I see are, yeah, I see some schools doing amazing things. Maybe they have amazing budgets, or they have an amazing principal who's setting the right temperature for taking risks for staff. But gosh, I just see really amazing things from teachers in terms of following the children. Are we talking about like groundbreaking, culturally, shifting inquiries where they're impacting, law or, social hierarchy? Or no, it doesn't have to be this big thing. We're talking about agency over time. We're talking about students slowly taking ownership over time. So I would say, just to pull it back to a really simple move. And I love what you had said earlier, Alex, is that the structures just become the water that we're swimming in, the air in which we're breathing. Like, they may feel a little clunky at first, but slowly it just becomes, the wallpaper for the space. One really early move we make is we co-design with the children. We co-design with the students. The sooner we invite their perspective and their opinion into being like a valued voice in the planning and creating the culture of learning, the sooner we do that, the sooner they see that not only are they more capable, but they're a valued contributing member of our learning community. So most of the schools I visit that I work with long term, we do a lot of co-designing the learning in the first few weeks of school. These little things that we do, and as I said earlier, they're going to compound long term. At the end of the year, it's really difficult for us to do something amazing or, earth shaking if we haven't shared the landscape of learning with our students earlier. That's just going to be performative at the end of the year. It's going to be like a gala or a showcase, and kids are going to be stressed and overwhelmed and anxious. But if they actually see that they're a valued member of the community and their voice is shaping next steps, that end experience is much more authentic, and it's going to be much more robust and meaningful because the students have actually been flexing that voice and that series of skills underneath that voice long term. So I know, Alex, I didn't give you a specific like story with a lot of color, a lot of context, partly because I don't want listeners to think, oh, I've got to go and do that thing that Trevor just said now. Like if I don't hit that target, I'm not as wonderful as that other teacher.
We're not throwing them in the deep.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I see amazing teachers doing amazing things in the four walls of their classrooms with the students that they have before them. And if we were to look at what those first 2 weeks looks like, we got to start co-designing early with students, asking them questions, mapping those, reflections out and having that kind of begin to shape the blueprint of how we're going to operate together long term. Again, for some students, it may feel clunky, as you said, Alex, especially teenagers. There might be a little bit of reticence, right? A little bit of like, is this worth marks? Or, when are you going to hit me with the assignment? When are you going to assign something, right? And is this really learning? Like we spent a whole day doing this. Is this really learning? And that all of that I just articulated, it just reflects that students have gotten used to a certain type of schooling experience. And now that they're having something new, of course, they're going to be like, is this guy for real? Or is this process really something we value in the class? And so if listeners are greeted, quote unquote, with reticence, it's actually a sign that you're on the right track. It's actually a sign that you need to lean into those routines and zoom out a little bit more and talk about why we're doing things the way we're doing them. So students can then zoom in and engage with a little bit of understanding and clarity as to where we're going and why we're going that direction, if you will.
So when you feel it's like clunky, we're actually on the right track. So that is very helpful. I think we could talk for 15 more hours. I would love to listen to you for so much longer. And this, I'm sure Hanneke and Alex feel the same. This has been amazing, Trevor. Thank you so much. And also really explaining it for everybody who's about to dip their toes into the shallow part of the pool, right? I hope people got curious enough to try it, to go for it. And even if it feels a little bit cold, maybe the shallow part, just try it. It'll be worth it, like you said, right? We'll get used to the uncomfortable part before we learn to swim. So that is really, really amazing, inspiring. Any last words of you, Trevor, before we go?
No, just incredibly grateful. I think, when I look back at my formative years, as I shared at the onset, and how I was learning from colleagues, I was learning from mentors, that was a long time ago. And I think my learning was limited to my community in the building, who I was bumping into at the photocopier or who was in my department. My mentors were there in the space. And I think you all bringing us together and sharing these conversations globally, like it just helps us find one another in ways in which couldn't happen 15, 20, 25 years ago. So my deep gratitude for helping bring more of these conversations globally and helping it reach more teachers that perhaps we physically can't visit their schools, but we could tune in and have a listen or a watch to a conversation like this. I think it's really, really important work that each of you are doing, both together and individually. So I applaud you and I thank you and I encourage you to keep going. Okay.
Thanks so much. And then I forgot to ask the very final question that we always ask. And that is, what is your dream for the future of education?
I just, undeniably curiosity is at the center of that table. But I just want a really joyful, meaningful learning, experience for all of our children through their schooling experience from the youngest years till they leave. I want them to reflect and say, gosh, school was good to me. And not that school was a waste of time or I didn't learn much in school. It was that school is good to me and that they see themselves as being capable and competent through their schooling experience. That would be my dream. And that already exists in so many places globally. We're just trying to have that be the norm rather than the outlier, if you will.
Cool is good to
Thank
me. Oh my goodness. I love that. That is a perfect ending of this wonderful podcast. Thank you so much, Trevor.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate each of you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you for the positivity.
The 100 Connected podcast is a creation of the Connection Committee, Annette De Graaf, Sherelle Trippers, Hanneke, Mackie, and Lindsay Stewart, and is produced by 100 and edited by me, Alex Shapero. Learn more about 100, its innovations, and our community by visiting our website at 100.org.